It really does not make any sense to me.
Ladies, gentlemen, and those with the good sense to do away with the whole notion, I welcome you to the premier audio medium for all your Fazbear entertainment needs, the Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast. Note, FFPP is not responsible for any loss of appetite, disinterest, dismemberment, or other legally classified statuses. So strap in and enjoy.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast. I'm your host of the Toast, or I Toast, here to talk about Five Nights at Freddy's like we always do. Today, I kind of wanted to just take another questions day. Cards on the table, we leave for vacation in less than 5 hours at this point. So I'm just trying to squeeze out another podcast to make sure that your usual viewing experience is interrupted as little as possible. The second channel and the third channel are going to suffer a little bit, but I just didn't have the time. Luckily, the podcast and the main channel video for this upcoming week, or the week you're currently in, I guess as of Tuesday, is good. It's finished, so good on that. But I kind of just wanted to answer a bunch of questions. I kind of just wanted to answer a bunch of questions today. So as a reminder, as always, if you want your questions answered on the podcast or your theories looked at, send them into Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast at gmail.com. And that's in the description to copy and paste because it's a pain to type out, but typically I'll go through them like so. Our first question comes from Eamon, they, them. It always bugged me that the White Tiger spirit is adult-sized. If it's meant to be David, wouldn't he be smaller if this was a representation of a little boy? So I don't think the White Tiger spirit is David. I think it's someone who is consumed with thoughts about David in death. Someone adult-sized who knew what David was like, his curiosity, his love of the White Tiger plush. I think the White Tiger spirit is Edwin. Picture this. Edwin is dying from his wounds in the explosion. He's calling out for M2 to help, and M2 replies with something that Edwin himself had used dozens of times to dismiss his own son, and to get him to go away. Edwin is suddenly confronted with what kind of father he was to his son, and how much he ignored him. In my mind, after David's death, Edwin kept the White Tiger plush on his desk so that he could keep the last connection to his son close by as a reminder. Edwin is now lying on the floor, consumed with grief and pain, clutching the White Tiger plush close, and in his dying moments thinking about his son when he was alive. How curious David always was about anyone new coming to the factory, how cheerful he was, how adorable his giggle was. And so, with those final thoughts, Edwin manifests in death into a spirit of his son's favorite plush toy, forever doomed to roam the halls of his factory, thinking of his lost son. Does this have a lot of evidence to back it up? No. But it's a really fun theory for me, and narratively, I love it. Thank you for your question. I think I agree with you, in the sense that I don't agree with the theory. I don't think Edwin being the White Tiger makes that much sense evidentiarily. But narratively, what a compelling theory. Right? This narratively is really interesting. Of, the guy who basically would distract his son with toys or costumes in a way to get him to, leave him alone so he could get his job done. That guy in death becoming another costume that would have entertained his child. Narratively, that's awesome. I think evidence-wise, the White Tiger plush isn't on his desk, which maybe they wanted to save that for the New Game Plus reveal. But they could have put it on his desk and then made something else be the New Game Plus reveal. We do get the evidence that in the last thing he heard was M2 mocking how bad of a father he was. So there's that for sure. I think it is technically possible. I don't think it's likely, but I do like the concept of this theory, especially when you consider what the White Tiger does throughout the game. Not only is yes, he kind of being like David, where he's curious about people coming to the factory and all that. But think about if you're Edwin and you're the White Tiger roaming the halls as a protector of your child, and somebody enters your factory, you're going to try to get an eye on them, see who it is. But he mostly leaves us alone. He lets us do our own thing. The only time the White Tiger is aggressive is in that basement. And, we'd been thinking maybe it's because of the spiritual connection to that basement. But if in Edwin's belief, that basement is spiritual, right? That's where he heard Fiona for the first time. Maybe he heard David down there too. So it could also be interpreted in this lens of, if the white tiger is Edwin, that the reason he's attacking us in the basement isn't necessarily because we're like in his domain or anything, but more of the fact that he doesn't want us to desecrate this place, right? Like, we've been going through the factory, destroying every room we visit, and then we visit the room that he heard his dead son and dead wife inside of. He doesn't want us to destroy that room. He wants us to get out so he can keep this room safe and keep trying to hear his son and wife. So I do think, narratively, there's a lot of interesting concepts to look at that. This is one of those theories that, like... quick intermission, because I'm going to stand up because I'm tired. I've learned the reason I felt so tired recently is because I've been sitting down. Because I've been editing while walking and standing a lot. So now when I sit down for more than like a half hour at a time, I just get tired and drained. And I think it's my body. I think part of it is, you know, the whole moving and everything and packing, getting ready for vacation and working double time. I think it's just building up, and hopefully vacation helps to reset me a little bit. But I think literally part of it is just, since I work standing and walking so much, when I sit down, my body is like, oh, it's time to relax. So hopefully this helps me feel a bit more awake. Anyway, where was I? Yes, this theory is a perfect example of the kind of theory that, while it may not be likely, it may not be true, it is interesting and helpful to think about and play in that space of. And, you know, I feel like a lot of people, I was talking about this on stream last night, a lot of people in the theory space, especially on Twitter, lose this idea of, you know, theory crafting isn't just to be right. We don't theory craft specifically and only to be correct about what the true story of FNAF is. We theory craft for a lot of reasons, but one of those is also to have fun, right? Like, it's okay to be like, there's not a lot of evidence for this, but I want to see where this goes, you know? And like, sure, there's fan fiction, so there's that if you want to really, really delve into it. But then there's also the idea of like, look, if there's not evidence for it, but you want to see how far this rabbit hole goes, then do that, and maybe you'll find evidence along the way, right? Some of the best theories out there didn't start having evidence. They started with a cool idea, you look into the idea, and you find evidence along the way, you know? And, you know, maybe ultimately it's wrong, and that's still okay. But it was a fun thing to do and a fun way to think about something, to get your mind in a different space. Especially with the idea of like, for example, this theory. Do I think Edwin is the white tiger? No. But if I play in that space, now I'm considering things like, well, maybe the white tiger isn't necessarily attacking you because it's strongest in the basement. Maybe the white tiger is protecting the basement, which is not something I really would have thought of if I was under the impression that the white tiger was David, who I think if the white tiger is any specific person, it probably is David. But I don't think of David as a protecting spirit, so I wouldn't have considered the fact that the white tiger is protecting the basement if I remained on the David train. So it's things like that where like, theory crafting is fun in and of itself, even if you're going into something that you think is wrong. But more than that, you know, for the people who really do want to be right, it's okay to be wrong for a bit. You know, everybody is wrong until somebody is right. And with a game like FNAF, no one's really going to definitively be right pretty much ever. So it's okay to be wrong. And it's okay to explore things that might not be likely, like this. Especially if it's as narratively satisfying as what you put up. But again, thank you for your question. And our next one comes from Liam, him. I don't know if this has any significance in the slightest, but in the prototype pizzeria, there's the layout for the FNAF 3 camera systems. I'm not that up to date on my FNAF lore, but does this mean anything? No, you're good, Liam. Thank you for your question. It's not a matter of being up to date. That is possibly one of the most confusing things about this game, is the fact that the FNAF 3 map exists in the prototype pizzeria. What is that about? It really does not make any sense to me. I know a lot of people have been tempted to assume that the FNAF 3 map is a placeholder asset. That like that desk, you know, in the standard version of that model has the FNAF 3 map there. And I get the temptation because you're able to write off this insane lore detail. But at the same time, I'm really tired of people assuming weird parts of FNAF are a mistake. There's always been really weird parts of FNAF, right? And ever since Security Breach, anytime a Steel Wool game comes out, anytime something doesn't immediately fit cleanly into the game, it's presumed to be a mistake. And that's crazy. That's not how we should be looking at these games. That like the moment something inside of it doesn't immediately make sense, it's an accident, right? Like these are professionally made games. Things that are in there for a reason, especially very front and center things. Like if there's a page in like the corner of a map somewhere where like there's text that is insane, okay, maybe that was a mistake. You know, it's in the background, it's in a corner somewhere, it might have gotten overlooked, sure. But this set piece is the center focus of the main reveal of the post game. Surely, if they didn't want the FNAF 3 map on that table, it wouldn't be there. Now look, if an update comes out and that map is gone, then I'll join the train. I'll be like, okay, somehow it was a mistake and they removed it. But until that happens, I see no reason to assume it was a mistake. That FNAF 3 map is there for a reason. So we, unfortunately, have to figure out what that reason is. There's a couple ways this could be interpreted and a couple ways to like explain where the FNAF 3 map is coming from. None of them fit really cleanly. I think the first and immediate solution, it has something to do with the indie dev logic of Help Wanted. That the FNAF games we've played before Help Wanted were made by an in-universe indie dev, and they are in-universe games that exist. In the story Help Wanted, when a similar thing happens in the books where Fazbear hires somebody to make Five Nights at Freddy's games, he makes the first 3 and part of the 4th, and they send him things to make games about. So if we're using that logic, and whoever Fazbear hired to make the indie games, they also sent documents over, could this map be that? Possibly. Now, the problem here is how early in the timeline this is. This is like 1979, and who knows when this room was created. And theoretically, the indie dev thing wouldn't have had to happen until after all the terrible stuff happened at Fazbear and they needed to clean up their branding. But the idea that a research and development prototype pizzeria had other layouts available to them is totally valid. My thinking of like why this map exists is not that this early in the timeline, FNAF 3 was planned, or Fazbear's Frights was on the table to build. My only thought is that since this is still in research and development, there were several different pizzerias that were planned to that were in talks of being made, and one of them was this version, the version that is most similar to the Help Wanted FNAF 1, because it's not even that similar to FNAF 1. It's more so Help Wanted FNAF 1. But I would not doubt if there were several layouts floated before they built this version. And maybe one of those layouts was the FNAF 3 map. So then it's like, okay, how do we get this all the way to FNAF 3? Well, if in creating this prototype pizzeria, they came up with several possible layouts for FNAF, for Freddy's locations, right? And then they nailed down one and they made that one the standard. They still have a lot of extra layouts and, floor plans and blueprints for Freddy's locations. So if, 50 years into the future, Fazbear needs to clean up their act and kind of make fun of themselves, but they don't want to base it off of real stuff, well, they look through their files and they find out they have a bunch of blueprints for Fazbear pizzerias that were never made. And they have somebody making games about Freddy Fazbear's Pizzas. So, if they can further obfuscate what the truth is and have this guy make the Freddy's pizzerias that are not real, so then there's no one-to-one restaurant to link these crimes to, that's probably really useful. So, maybe that's why, FNAF 1, FNAF 2, FNAF 3, these buildings, now FNAF 3 is Fazbear's Frights, but still, these buildings are not one-to-one with the Help Wanted 1 pizzeria. Maybe the Help Wanted 1 pizzeria was the most accurate version of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. However, every Freddy Fazbear's Pizza we've seen in games is inaccurate, not because of a mistake, not because of a retcon, but because when Fazbear was trying to obfuscate the truth, The games that they hired this guy to make that featured these crimes, they didn't want people trying to figure out what restaurants they were in, so they were all incorrect or never really made Freddy Fazbear's Pizza layouts, using these extra ones from research and development that never got made. Is there very, very little evidence to suggest this? Yes. But it's frankly the only way that I can rationalize why the FNAF 3 map exists in 1979. Because there's no way that they were planning Fazbear's Frights before Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Let's be super real about this, right? So my only rational explanation is that when making the indie games, Fazbear wanted to make sure that no crimes could be possibly linked to currently existing Freddy Fazbear's Pizza or ever existing Freddy Fazbear's Pizzas, right? So in doing that, they only used layouts from research and development that were never truly made. Those being the blueprints that were already floated around. One of them we get to see in Secret of the Mimic. Because if it's not that, I have no idea why the FNAF 3 map is here. That is literally the only explanation I can think of that doesn't break my brain trying to figure out. But you know, hey, maybe we're lucky and it's a mistake and we don't have to figure it out. But I truly am getting really sick of the mindset of the moment something weird appears in a FNAF game, it's a mistake. It's automatically assumed to be a mistake. It's like, guys, let's be super real. Security breach was mishandled. We know that. Scott knows that. Everyone knows that. Ever since Security Breach, they have been in lockstep making good shit. And yes, there's weird stuff. There's always been weird stuff. Could you imagine if we had this mentality for like FNAF 1? Like FNAF 1 is not a masterpiece. FNAF 1 is Scott Cawthon's prototype Iron Man suit, right? He made FNAF 1 in a cave with a box of scraps. It's a good game, but there's a lot weird about it. And if we assumed some of that weird stuff was a mistake, we wouldn't have like anything. Right? Like imagine if you were playing FNAF 1 with this mentality and then you get the Golden Freddy jump scare where your game crashes and you just see that freeze frame and you're like, huh, the game crashed? That's weird. Why? That must be a mistake. That's probably not supposed to happen. And it's like, what? I don't know. I get really mad anymore when like in the big old 2025, people are still being like, something doesn't add up in my FNAF game. Must be a mistake. Like, come on, guys. But yes, Liam, not saying you said that, but I wanted to bring up your question to also talk about that point. But thank you for your question. Our next question comes from Jonah, they, them. Do you believe as of late, Scott has been trying to subtly imply that the MCI was the first of the murders? We've seen potential evidence in this from things such as the secret Princess Quest grave order, Chico's famous voice line, John FNAF's Midnight Motorist theory, etc. If so, what are the new implications for the timeline considering this new theory? I've always been a big opponent to MCI being the first set of murders because, like, why? Why would that have ever happened if there was no other inciting incidents? But Secret of the Mimic, in a way, could be giving us the inciting incident. Because, again, we don't necessarily need an inciting incident. William Afton could have just done that. But it feels a little cheap to have this, like, really deep, interesting story. And the inciting incident that started off 99% of it just happened on a whim. Right? So, my only thoughts for if the MCI is first is that William Afton saw what happened with the Mimic and M2 and M1 and all this possible possession stuff and wanted to see if he could get an animatronic to get possessed in a similar way. And then that's why MCI happened. Maybe, but again, it's so... I just don't see a great reason for the MCI to happen first. It's just so strange to me for that to be the first thing that happens William Afton-wise, right? But you're right. More and more stuff is coming out that seems to be pointing in that direction. With the Princess Quest grave order putting the puppet after the MCI. Charlie happening after the MCI is crazy to me. We don't get a lot for the crying child, but, you know, he can kind of go wherever. I think the crying child being first because there's no prerequisites does make the most sense. But at the same time, since there are no prerequisites, the crying child could really be anywhere in that timeline. But yeah, it's something that the more like the MCI is such an extreme thing that happens that the more ways you can justify it, I think the better. And the less you justify it, the more out of place it feels. For me anyway. But if the MCI was first, right, I think that then explains the fun times where, you know, once the MCI gets caught, it's like, I need to do this more subtly, so I make the fun times. I think the puppet existing makes more sense because, like, once children go missing, you need to up your security. If the MCI happened before the crying child, that would then explain why the kids talk about children going missing at night instead of just being like a weird one-off line. So like a lot of stuff does get explained if the MCI happens first. Frankly, the main thing that goes unexplained and underdeveloped if the MCI happens first is the MCI, like more than anything. So yeah, it's weird. I don't love it. But I do agree with you that it seems like more and more evidence is coming out pointing towards that direction. But thank you for your question. The next one comes from Zahar, they, them. Do you think in the Post-it notes room, it's the mimic making those notes? Because I recently thought of it, and it seems like a good theory. Thank you for your question. It's a weird thing, right? So on one hand, I think the Post-it notes are inherently mimic adjacent. The idea, because the Post-it notes really do read like a robot gaining sentience, which is very mimic coded. The problem with those Post-it notes in the silo being the mimic is that the mimic is in the basement in Security Breach. It's locked in the basement by Ruin. It's left in the basement in Secret of the Mimic. So if the silo Post-it notes are made by the mimic, this would imply that at some point in the timeline, the mimic was released from the basement, put into the silo, and then put back into the basement, which feels strange to me. But here's another idea that I've had, and it's that those Post-it notes are Gregory being under the control of the mimic. And now that we've played Secret of the Mimic, I think there's actually more evidence for this than there was beforehand. So when considering how the mimic functions within people's minds, I was thinking a lot about how M2 doesn't really work for a while, right? He's like, he can't figure out how to get M2 to work. And we know M2 was eventually put into the mimic endoskeleton. So I've connected that the mimic schematics only take into effect if you can put them into a proper body. And then they can start to absorb the environment and serve the environment around them and learn. The mimic needs a host to form. And I've been thinking about that more and more. If that's true, that kind of then makes a lot of sense with Vanessa, with Gregory, with Glitchtrap, these iterations of the mimic program that are put into a body and then develop into a personality. We have it with Vanny, we have the same thing with Dr. Rabbit, and in a way we have it with Glitchtrap, where the mimic code is uploaded to Help Wanted, and it forms a body out of the code that's there. And once it has that body, it starts to learn everything in front of it, you know? So when thinking about the Post-it note room, that definitely does feel like a robot gaining sentience. But if it's true that when the mimic iterates inside of a body, it's then able to replicate a personality, this silo does make a lot of sense for Gregory's drop-off point, right? Vanessa takes Gregory, or Vanny, I guess, would be the one taking Gregory and putting the mimic schematics into his mind. And now that it's in there, locks him in the silo until he's done. And while he's in the silo, he starts self-developing and self-actualizing, and his mind starts to be complete into the mimic. Or at this point, right, because we have M1, M2, Glitchtrap, I believe, is M3, Vanny would be M4, Gregory would be M5. So now M5 is developing into Dr. Rabbit. And this also goes off of the idea that, you know, it's directly stated that M2 is a copy of M1's code. and then it was developed differently. So I like the idea, similar to I hate to reference to this, but similar to like that person pointed out on the emails for In the Flesh, the spring traps being iterations upon themselves, linking to the Mimic. I think that's true. And it's the idea of M2 is a copy of M1's code that is developed further and differently. So then Glitch Trap, M3, is a copy of M2's code that is developed differently. And then Vanny is a copy of M3's code that is developed differently. And then Dr. Rabbit is a copy of M4's code, which is developed differently. I do like that a lot. And then the idea that the development for M5 was put him in a silo until he's done. That's fair. And that would then explain why all those sticky notes are in the silo, but the access to the silo is still fairly easy to get to. It's just in the laundry room, right? Just you go down the steps in the laundry room, you're there. So my thinking is, yes, the Post-it note room is the Mimic. My thinking is that, yes, in Security Breach, the Post-it notes are made by the Mimic, but it's M5. So it's Gregory as being controlled by the Mimic, doing those sticky notes until he is useful to M3 and M4. That's my thoughts behind it. But thank you for your question. Our next question comes from Fantastic, him. Ever since I played Secret of the Mimic for the first time and choosing ending 2, I've not been able to stop wondering, why is it called parachute.exe? When I activated it, I thought I would get some kind of parachute sky delivery with Mexus or something to trap the Mimic, but I did not see a single parachute in that ending. Have I just missed something? Thank you for your question. So, now what's interesting is parachute.exe at first is very easy and straightforward, and then immediately becomes complicated again. Because, so in the business world, and I'm going to look this up to not mess this up. Yeah, so in the business world, there's a term such as a golden parachute, which is essentially an agreement between a company and an employee that specifies the employee will from Wikipedia. A golden parachute is an agreement between a company and an employee specifying that the employee will receive certain significant benefits if the employment is terminated. This may include severance pay, cash bonuses, stock options, or other benefits. And the dictionary definition from Oxford Language, a large payment or other financial compensation guaranteed to a company executive should the executive be dismissed as a result of a merger or takeover. Essentially, a golden parachute in the business world is if your company, it's something in your contract that if you are fired, you are given a big stack of cash to land safely. So it's something to carry you over until your next job. It's something in the CEO world is fairly standard, where it's your in case the company fails or in case you are cut, you have a backup. So parachute.exe, I feel like, and when I saw that immediately, I'm like, oh, okay. When we activate this, we get a secret escape tunnel that leads us to the exit of the building. So parachute.exe is, I'm in trouble, I need to get out of the building right now. And then it's so he can get out safely in case the company goes under. Bada bing, bada boom. But is that what happens? No. When you activate parachute.exe, you get a secret tunnel to the welcome show. At the welcome show, you can then play the goodbye show, and you go down to research and development. So, it's weird. It's weird, right? I'm fairly certain that... Is the goodbye show... I don't think so. I was like, is the goodbye show always available on the monitor, but you need executive access? I don't think so. I think activating parachute.exe is what allows you to activate the goodbye show that gets you down into research and development. So let me do this in two parts, because it's hard to fact check that right now. If that is not true, and parachute.exe just opens the escape tunnel to the front of the building, then I think that's just what it means. That parachute.exe is... things have gone under, I need to get out. And parachute.exe is Edwin's way of getting out. That is possible. That's weird, but it's possible. The other option. Now, if parachute.exe is what allows you to access the goodbye show, which is what allows you to access research and development, I think it is still possible that this is talking about something that is a safety or a precaution or a backup. In the sense that, right, consider how the Fazbear project looks to Murray's Costume Manor. It is an insanely big and lucrative contract that is supposed to save the company from going under. And it's also a secret. So we can't just say like the Fazbear project, like run access to Fazbear project. It is a secret project. So the idea that parachute.exe refers to getting access to work on the Fazbear project, I think does make sense. It's the idea that like this is the parachute for the company. The Fazbear project is the safe landing for Murray's Costume Manor so it can continue to function afterwards. And in that, the parachute of parachute.exe is just referring to this contract saving the company. I think that probably makes the most sense because you're right, there's no actual literal parachute involved, but it's also not just like a severance pay like a golden parachute would be in the real world. So there's something to it there. I think the most likely option, like I've said, is parachute.exe is referring to the fact that this contract is supposed to save the company. Is that guaranteed to be the truth? No, but that's the only thing I can think to explain it. Our next question comes from JMC Peak, him. I noticed that the giant Freddy head in the sinkhole is completely different than the one in the Secret of the Mimic, and it makes me think they're not the same or a recon/redesign, because the security breach head is larger, golden, and has an endo and an eyeball, has a full casing around the head hole, and has a bow tie, and is based on Glamrock Freddy, on the same layer as the FNAF 6 pizza place. While the one in the Secret of the Mimic one is smaller, brown, hollow, has an unfinished casing, and is based on OG Freddy. Also should be under the FNAF 6 pizza place. I think the security breach head is still unexplained and probably still important, and the Secret of the Mimic head is the parade float that Edwin made for Fazbear's. Also, do you think that the giant AR endo in the theater is connected to the Freddy head? You go in both their mouths to progress in the same game. Oh, you do, don't you? Okay, you have a second part of your question. I want to save it because I want to talk about that more. My thoughts on the Freddy head. Now, I know I just said we shouldn't assume mistakes, or we shouldn't assume weird things are mistakes, but security breach is the exception in the sense that we know security breach was mishandled by Scott, where he did not tell the full story to Steel Wool, so they were kind of just working with what they had. Because of that, I could see the giant Freddy head in the sinkhole meaning to be the one we see in Secret of the Mimic. I could see that, right? Because it doesn't make sense for Glamrock Freddy to exist in 1979. But I could see Scott, in trying to keep the story subtle and not give it away to Steel Wool, telling them, oh, and make sure there's a massive Freddy head outside of the FNAF 6 pizzeria. And they went, okay, well, Golden Freddy, or Glamrock Freddy, right? Understood. And by the time they made it, it was too late. So I could see that, and I could see that's why it's made differently, and the one we see in Secret of the Mimic is what it's supposed to look like. But you're right in the sense that it could still be a different head, because we do know they make parade floats. My only problem with the parade float idea is why would they make parade floats in research and development when they have a whole parade float room next to the warehouse? It would be weird to make it all the way down there and bring it up rather than just make it up. That's my thinking there. Regardless, another point that you raise here is the giant Freddy head in Security Breach is next to the FNAF 6 pizza place, but this one would be under it. I don't think that's true. I really truly think that the FNAF 6 pizzeria is built within the prototype pizzeria we see here. Because we know the FNAF 6 pizzeria is a big fake trap that is just a place to catch and burn people. I think that Henry uses the fake pizzeria, the prototype pizzeria, to create that trap because it's so hidden away, it's not public knowledge, and it's underground, so it's easy to tweak in the way he needs it to be. There's also already plenty of tunnels attached to it, and we know that the FNAF 6 pizzeria is a series of tunnels. So I think they are actually on the same layer, because I think the FNAF 6 pizzeria becomes, or I think the prototype pizzeria becomes the FNAF 6 pizzeria. But you have another part of your question that I think is really interesting. Small theory. The guns on the Monty catwalks are meant to progress Monty's show, like Captain Springlock in the Foxy Puppet Show. What an interesting theory. I love that. One of the things that's most interesting, I think, about Secret of the Mimic is how much the things we see in Secret of the Mimic show up throughout the rest of the franchise, but especially Security Breach. Because like I've mentioned before, the atrium elevator and the welcome show elevator, very similar in concept, somewhat similar in design. I didn't even think about the fact that the Captain Springlock progressed the story by shooting the targets is similar to the shoot the targets in Monty's catwalk to make the big thing go down. Because consider, this is also the only place where we get those cutouts and the ride through. Now, is it to progress Monty's show? I don't think so, but I think this is more evidence to show that the security breach Pizzaplex reused or borrowed a lot of the ideas and mechanics from Murray's Costume Manor. I think that is another example for that. And in that same vein, thank you for your question. Let's go to this next one. Ness, they, them. Do the reveals in Secret of the Mimic that Roxanne and Monty go back to the MCM era, especially with Monty being in the prototype pizzeria, lend to the idea that Edwin could still be alive and involved with the development of the Pizzaplex, like in the books? Okay, two thoughts. One, yes, it does. Two, I don't think that's true. So I'm of two minds. I do still think Edwin is dead. However, I cannot deny that the idea that Roxanne and Monty were Edwin originals that were lost to time and then suddenly pop up at the Pizzaplex, I can't deny that is good evidence that Edwin survived the explosion and is still somehow alive and is the one who introduced those characters to the Pizzaplex. I can't deny that. That's good logic. I think my hesitation with that is that Foxy seems awful sidelined in the Pizzaplex, which, like, Foxy seems to also be an Edwin original. It really seems like it. However, counterpoint, Foxy was planned to be added to Security Breach and just never got there. Maybe Edwin died. And also, Foxy was the one character that Fazbear really took and made their own from Edwin, so he might be a little sore about that. So I think there are ways to explain that. But I don't think Edwin is alive. I don't see a great way for him to be alive. Again, in a game where we see so much on-screen death and so much confirmation of death, the idea that the only thing we hear about Edwin is he was trapped under rubble and then the audio stops, that does open the opportunity for Edwin to survive. And there are plenty of connections that would make a lot more sense if Edwin was still alive. So I think it's completely valid to assume Edwin is alive. I'm not there yet. I personally don't think Edwin is alive, but I don't fault anybody for thinking that, and I don't think anyone is wrong for thinking that, right? And because it would really explain a lot of why so much of the Pizzaplex is so similar to Murray's Costume Manor. But in the same breath, and this is where I'm going to go to, a lot of that can be explained by the influence of the Mimic. We know for a fact that the Mimic was used to develop Help Wanted. And we know for a fact that at some point, Glitchtrap infiltrated the Pizzaplex's systems. So depending on how early the Mimic gets into Fazbear's systems, could mean that a lot of the Pizzaplex was developed using the Mimic technology, or at least the Mimic was secretly possibly guiding the development of the Pizzaplex. So whenever I see things in Murray's Costume Manor that have a really good connection or parallel to the Security Breach Pizzaplex, my first thought isn't Edwin is still around. My first thought is the Mimic is guiding this creation based upon what it knows. As we know, the Mimic recreates. We already had the Help Wanted rooms in Security Breach that a lot of people explained as the Mimic was just recreating the things it saw in Help Wanted. The same thing could be happening in the sense of like, oh, we need an elevator. Mimic goes through its catalog. I know about an elevator. Welcome to elevator. Oh, we want something to do in the upstage of Monty. Oh, I remember these cannons and targets. We can add those. Oh, we need new characters. Well, I have Roxy in my database. So I think that makes more sense to me than Edwin being alive. That's my take on that. Again, Edwin being alive, super valid. It's just not my preferred explanation. But thank you for your question, Ness. And I think our last question today, we're getting around 43 minutes on the recording, but I know there's a lot of pauses. Anonymous internet guy, she, they. After your most recent podcast episode, I thought about how to complete moon.exe to work, you have to collect toys, probably David's. I think definitely. One is David Blocks, one is David's Ball, and one's the White Tiger. Those are 100% David's. What if Moon doesn't represent Edwin's agony, but agony in general? That would mean that moon.exe requires agony or is powered by agony. Then the real question is, why was moon.exe created? That's an interesting point, because if we're collecting David's toys, are we then amassing agony, right? We see in the books that Phineas Taggart, the guy who's studying agony in the Fazbear Fright epilogues, the way he's studying agony is just collecting objects that were around tragedies. So something I hadn't considered, I think it's a really interesting way to look at this, is that moon.exe, the second half, we keep collecting these tragic objects and in a way are doing the same thing where we're collecting items that may or may not be consumed with agony. And in doing that, we are allowed permission to access the mimic and the glitched permission, right? So it is a really interesting concept. However, that's kind of where the connections end. So I don't know if that's necessarily intended or it was more of a metaphor of us collecting the memories of David to better be David, since M1 is the one who wants M2 to be David. And in that same vein, I do think M1 is the one who created moon.exe, because once you beat moon.exe, M1 shows up and talks to you directly, which to me says like M1 created this test and is waiting for somebody to beat it. And if M1 created this, I think that's also a point against the idea of us collecting agony rather than a metaphor of us collecting the memories of David. I think that's what makes the most sense there. But again, that is not to discredit the idea that we're collecting agony, because in a way, you're right. It's very similar to how Taggart collected agony-infused items to create the Stitch Wraith. So it's one of those things where it could go either way, depending on how you're interpreting the information in front of us, which again is probably my favorite thing about Secret of the Mimic, because it's so vague and up to interpretation, but unlike most like earlier FNAF games where the reason it was up to interpretation was because of a lack of information, Secret of the Mimic gives us so much information to work with, but none of it is immediately direct or immediately upfront and confirmed. The Secret of the Mimic information is up to interpretation, which is such a good way to take this franchise. Give us a lot to work with, but none of it be defined. So we have to still solve things and figure it out, but we're not scratching our heads, scraping at crumbs. We have a whole feast of stuff we don't understand. But yeah, thank you for your question. And thank you for all your questions. And thank you for the support to get me in here. I'm still in shock that we can have a place and I can have a room again. But if you want your questions answered on the podcast, feel free to send them into Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast at gmail.com. It's in the description, copy and paste because it's pain to type out. But until next time, as always, thank you for watching the Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast, where the pizza abilities are endless. We hope to enjoy your future patronage. Bye-bye for now.